July 5, 1943, the first day of the German offensive near Kursk. During the day, Stalin had already repeatedly called the commanders of the Central and Voronezh fronts, the generals of the armies, Konstantin Rokossovsky and Nikolai Vatutin. From their reports the Supreme quickly learned about the current situation. In the evening Stalin called Rokossovsky back to the phone. The general began to report the day's events quickly and clearly, but Stalin interrupted him with a question. Have our fighters gained air supremacy? Rokossovsky replied evasively. Comrade Stalin, it is impossible to say for sure. There was a fierce battle in the air, and both sides suffered heavy losses. The Supreme Commander was not satisfied with this answer. He understood that if the enemy's fighters gained the upper hand, it would clear the way for their bombers and attack aircraft, which would support the ground forces offensive, while simultaneously making it difficult for Soviet aircraft to counter the Wehrmacht's attacks. The upcoming battle was perceived by both sides as a key one, capable of radically influencing the further course of the war. For Germany, victory in it again opened the way to Moscow and Stalingrad. The task of dominating the air was a key one, and therefore Stalin repeated the question to Rokossovsky, tell me for sure, have you won or not? Yes or no? Once again, there was an evasive answer. To answer definitely yet, but we will resolve this issue positively tomorrow. Unfortunately, the illustrious commander could not keep his word either tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. By April 1943, on the Soviet-German front line in the area of a bulge formed in Kursk. Here are the positions the Red Army was wedged into the German defenses to a depth of 100 to 120 kilometers. The ledge was 250 kilometers wide. It was a good springboard for further attacks and strikes behind enemy lines. Oryol and Kharkiv directions. However, this configuration of the front line was fraught with danger for the Soviet troops, which the Germans took advantage of. Their plan of operation, called the Citadel, called for two massive counterattacks from the north and south, with a general direction towards Kursk. If successful, significant Red Army forces would have been surrounded. The Wehrmacht began preparations for Operation Citadel in mid-April 1943. The best German forces began to be transferred to Kursk. These preparations did not go unnoticed by Soviet intelligence. The Red Army began to create a long-term defense with thousands of kilometers of trenches and barriers, hundreds of firing points. This has already been the subject of close study by German intelligence. The German General Staff once again chose the tactics of a lightning war. Everything took 5 days, and the advanced units had to cover an average of about 30 kilometers per day. The German generals understood that without powerful aviation training, an offensive against Soviet positions would be doomed to failure. By the summer of 1943, the Luftwaffe had two main types of fighters. The first of them is the Messerschmitt Bf 109. It was created back in 1935, and all this time the machine has been constantly being improved. Thus, the maximum speed of the 109th reached 650 km per hour. While for Soviet fighters in the first year and a half of the war it was no more than 600 km per hour. The second type of German fighter was the Focke-Wulf Fw-190. It was a new aircraft that was on the Eastern Front, appeared in the autumn of 1942. Its speed was slightly lower than that of the Messerschmitt, at 620 km per hour. He also lost in maneuverability. But the Focke-Wulf had exceptionally powerful weapons. 420mm cannons and two 7.92mm machine guns. According to this indicator, among single-engine aircraft in World War II, he had no equal at all. The Focke-Wulf had another fundamental difference from the Messerschmitt Bf 109, the engine of the 109th was liquid-cooled. If a shell broke through the radiator tubes in battle, the coolant would leak out, and after a few minutes the engine would overheat and could fail. But the Focke-Wulf engine was cooled by the incoming airflow and was therefore less sensitive to projectile hits, which significantly increased the survivability of the machine. Moreover, since such a motor had a large cross-section, it even served as a kind of protection for the pilot. At the same time, Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf Fw 190 inches complemented each other. If the 109th was more suitable for conducting maneuverable combat with fighters, then the well-armed Focke-Wulf was more successful against bombers and attack aircraft. In aviation, the Red Army's equivalent of the Messerschmitt Bf 109 were fighters from the design bureau Alexandra Yakovleva. Yaks, they were also equipped with water-cooled engines, and therefore it is customary to compare them with the 109th. The Yak-1 was created in the 40th year. In the first months of the war, he lost to Messerschmitt in both speed and maneuverability. However, the Yak still looked better than other Soviet fighters, and therefore all efforts were decided to focus on its serial production. In addition, the Yak-7 was put into production. Initially, it was a two-seat training fighter, which was created before the war on the basis of the same Yak-1. In the autumn of the 41st, the training vehicle was converted into a combat vehicle, armed with a cannon and two machine guns. Yak-1 and the Yak-7 formed the basis of Soviet fighter aviation until the 43rd year. All this time, the designers have repeatedly tried to improve their characteristics. We reduced weight, improved aerodynamics, and increased engine power. But it took a long time to catch up with the German fighters. In the second half of the 42nd year, another attempt was made. The Yak-1 was used as a basis, and some of its wooden parts were replaced with duralumin ones, which were more durable and lighter at the same time. Its maximum speed increased slightly, from 588 to 600 km per hour. But the lightweight aircraft has become significantly more maneuverable. In the vertical maneuver, that is, in the rate of climb, the Yak-9 and the Messerschmitt Bf 109 were approximately equal, but in the horizontal, the advantage was already on the side of the Yak-9. He completed a 360-ring operator turn in 17 seconds, 3 to 4 seconds faster than the Bf 109. In battle, this allowed either to break away from the enemy, or to enter his tail faster to attack. German planes and Yak-9s fought on equal terms. In fact, the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Yak-9s were equal, it all depended on the pilot. The Yak-9 was lighter, so it could be used to develop special versions of the fighter. So, in the spring of 1943, the Yak-9T was put into service. Instead of the standard 20mm cannon, a heavier and more powerful 37mm cannon was installed in the nose of the aircraft. During the war, more than 24 modifications were created on the basis of the Yak-9. Among them are a photo reconnaissance aircraft, a fighter, bomber with a payload of 400 kilograms, a high-altitude interceptor with a ceiling of 13 kilometers, and a long-range fighter capable of flying 1,800 kilometers. In total, until May 1945, factories produced 5,000 Yak-9, and it became the most massive Soviet fighter. The Great Patriotic War. Before the Battle of Kursk on the Yak-9 had high hopes, just like the other new Soviet fighter, the La-5. This aircraft had an air-cooled engine and was to some extent a response to the appearance of the German Focke-Wulf Fw-190C. La-5 was created in the constructive bureau of Semyon Lavochkin in the spring of 1942. However, it took time for the aircraft to reach its full potential. By the summer of 1943, the La-5 with the FN index was put into mass production. An improved engine was installed on the aircraft. If earlier it produced 1,700 horsepower in afterburner mode, now it produces 1,850 HP. The maximum speed of the aircraft increased from 600 to 630 km per hour, which already corresponded to the level of German fighters. This gave the pilots confidence. However, under Kursk still had few La-5 FN fighters. The La-5 made a turn in the horizontal plane in 19 seconds, that is, 1 to 2 seconds faster than the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and 3 to 4 seconds faster than the Focke-Wulf Fw 190. If we evaluate the level of Soviet and German fighter aircraft from a purely technical point of view, then by the beginning Kursk Air Force battle the Red Army managed to achieve parity in many ways. In the coming battle, one could expect a turning point in the war in the air. The German offensive began on July 5 at 4:40 a.m. with heavy artillery preparation. Next, the first groups of German planes appeared in the sky. The bombers flew to pre-designated targets at different altitudes and from different directions. The intervals between raids on Soviet positions were kept to a minimum. At some points, there were up to 300 Luftwaffe aircraft over certain sections of the front. When Soviet fighters tried to approach the German bombers, they were immediately attacked by Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf's Fw 190s covering them. At the same time, the Germans very skillfully controlled the actions of their fighter aircraft. If necessary, they quickly increased their forces on one or another sector of the front. There was a feeling of their constant numerical superiority in the air. From the reports of the 163rd Fighter Aviation Regiment, the Red Army, at the same time, there were so many attacks on our facilities that it was not possible to send more than 4 aircraft to combat them. At the same time, there were 6 to 8 enemy fighters for each of our fighters. On the first day of the offensive, German fighter aircraft seized air supremacy. As a result, Luftwaffe attack aircraft and bombers literally bombarded their positions without encountering decent resistance. Tons of bombs for the Red Army. Under these blows, the Soviet defenses were breached in many places. Assessing the results of the first day of Operation Citadel, the German command noted the exceptional role of the Luftwaffe as confident of the success of the offensive. On the evening of July 5, several meetings were held at the headquarters of the Soviet forces, where the current situation was discussed. First of all, it was necessary to improve the management of fighter aircraft operations and increase the efficiency of decision-making. The fighter aircraft's air patrol areas were moved beyond the front line, into foreign territory. It was possible to detect the enemy earlier. The most experienced commanders of the Air Force were sent to the front line. They were supposed to monitor the situation and, at the right moment, call for reinforcements for patrol groups that joined the battle. Meanwhile, fierce battles unfolded in the land theater of military operations. The success of the offensive, according to Hitler's new heavy tanks, the TV Panther and TV Tiger, were to be provided. At that time, they were considered the best in the world in terms of protection and weapons. The Tiger stood out in particular. He was armed with an 88mm cannon, and the thickness of his armor plates reached up to 110mm. The Soviet military had the opportunity to get acquainted with the fighting qualities of the Tiger at the beginning of the 43rd year. In January, one of these vehicles was captured near Leningrad. The tank was delivered to the landfill in Moscow region Kubinka, where he was literally tested for strength. During the firing of the Tiger, only the 85mm anti-aircraft gun proved itself well. His armor-piercing shell penetrated the frontal armor of the tank from a distance of 1 kilometer. But the M42 guns of the 45mm caliber, the ZIS-2 of the 57mm caliber and the divisional 76mm ZIS-3 cannon, that is, the entire backbone of the Soviet anti-tank artillery, turned out to be practically useless when firing at the frontal projection of the Tiger. Only fire on less protected sides produced results, and even then at distances of no more than 500 meters. But by the summer of 1943, the Wehrmacht had also received a new Ferdinand self-propelled artillery system. The thickness of its frontal armor was even greater than that of the Tiger, 200 millimeters. The Germans viewed their new tracked vehicles as a kind of steel ram capable of breaking through any defense. Army Group Center, which was advancing from the north, had 45 Tigers and 90 Ferdinand self-propelled guns. Army Group South has over 100 Tigers and about 200 Panthers. In a special order on the eve of the offensive, Hitler wrote, "Soldiers, from today on, you will become participants in the largest offensive battles, the outcome of which can decide the war." So far, the Russians have been helped primarily by their tanks in achieving various successes. But now you have better tanks than the Russians. Soviet defense under Kursk was built primarily as an anti-tank. All approaches to positions the Red Army was actively mined. The depth of the minefields reached 100 meters. The mines were located in 3 to 4 rows, the distance between them was from 6 to 10 meters. The anti-tank mines had a rectangular or cylindrical steel body. The mines weighed a little more than 5 kilograms, of which 3 to 4 kilograms were explosive. In 1943, a new, more advanced TMDB mine appeared. In 1943, a new, more advanced mine, the TMDB, appeared. The explosive mass was increased to 7 to 8 kilograms. This mine had a wooden body, was simple in design, could be manufactured directly by the troops and did not require the transportation of materials from engineering warehouses. The gunners' positions were located just behind the minefields. When preparing for battle, the command realized that the capabilities of anti-tank guns were very limited. In this regard, the main focus was on improving the combat training of the personnel. In parallel, comprehensive moral and psychological training of soldiers for the upcoming battle was carried out. A targeted search was conducted in all artillery units for the most experienced gunner commanders. They were selected and sent to special anti-tank fighter regiments and brigades, where they could maximize their skills in the fight against enemy armored vehicles. Visual aids have been released for the Red Army soldiers. They showed the most vulnerable parts of the German Tiger. When firing various weapons, the gunners first had to aim at the sides and undercarriage. Small arms fire should have been directed into the viewing slots and optical devices of the tank. Calculations of anti-tank guns were recommended to shoot at the barrel of the Tiger to cover particularly important areas, where enemy tank breakthroughs were expected in the first place. 85 mm anti-aircraft guns were transferred to the reserve of the fronts. At the same time, it was separately stipulated that it was prohibited to use them to fire at aircraft. On the morning of July 5, immediately after the artillery preparation, the German ground forces, with the support of aviation, rushed to attack from the north. On the position the Red Army was advancing with a total of 500 tanks and self-propelled guns under Kursk. In order to shoot for sure, the Soviet anti-tankers tried to act from ambushes and let the German armored vehicles get as close as possible, at a distance of only 100 to 200 meters. In such conditions, iron endurance was required from the fighters. In case of a miss, there might not be enough time to refire. During July 5, Soviet fighters repulsed 4 massive attacks. Only as a result of the 5th attack was the enemy able to break through the defensive line and advance no more than 6 kilometers. On the southern flank, the Wehrmacht threw about 700 tracked vehicles into battle. The elite of the German army operated here, the SS Panzer divisions, Adolf Hitler, Reich, Death's Head. However, by the end of the day, the Germans had managed to wedge themselves into the Soviet defenses only in 2 narrow sectors of the front. This was clearly not the result that the German generals had hoped for. Nevertheless, following the results of the first day of the battle, the Soviet command decided to strengthen its defensive positions. For the first time, large tank formations such as corps and armies were used for this purpose. They were included in the second echelon of defense. In the event of a breakthrough of the first line, they were supposed to prevent the enemy from advancing further. In the Battle of Kursk, the main Soviet tank was the T-34. In the first year of the war, the T-34 was superior to German vehicles in terms of its combat qualities. However, by the summer of 1943, the situation had changed dramatically. The Germans seriously strengthened the armor protection and armament of their main medium tanks, the PZ. KPFW. When the T-34 passed comparative tests with the captured Tiger in the spring of 1943, it turned out that it could only penetrate the armor protection of a German tank from a distance of 200 meters. At the same time, the Tiger cannon confidently pierced the T-34 armor from a mile away. It was planned to improve the characteristics of the T-34 tank back in 1941, but the outbreak of war changed these plans. It was necessary to increase the mass production of tanks, so there could be no question of any reorganization of the quality characteristics of the T-34. The designers were mainly engaged in simplifying the design and improving production technology. If in 1941, in the same year, the average monthly production of T-34s did not exceed 400 units, but by the middle of 1942, the plants had reached a total rate of 1,500 tanks, that is, almost 4 times more. In the summer of 1943, under Kursk the Red Army had almost 6,000 armored tracked vehicles, twice as many as the enemy. At the same time, T-34s accounted for more than 60% of the Soviet tank fleet. The use of such powerful tank formations to hold the defense has become a new form of their operational use. On the morning of July 6, when the Germans broke through the positions the Red Army in the northern sector on the Kursk Bulge, the 2nd Tank Army under the command of Lieutenant General was thrown into battle. Alexei Radina and the 19th Tank Corps. They launched a counterattack on the advancing enemy. Against well-defended Tigers, Soviet tankers tried to operate in close combat, using the best mobility of their lighter vehicles. By actively maneuvering on the battlefield, the Soviet tankers reduced the distance to the enemy and negated the advantages of the German Tigers in armor protection and armament. The Wehrmacht was forced to throw additional forces into the breakthrough. And although the Germans managed to advance 10 kilometers by the end of the day, they failed to completely break through the Soviet defenses. In the southern sector of the arc, the Soviet positions were reinforced by the 1st Tank Army of Lieutenant General Michael Katakov, as well as the 2nd and 5th Guards Tank Corps. A different tactic was chosen here. Instead of a counterattack, the tankers took up defense, actually performing the tasks of anti-tank artillery. When the Germans resumed their offensive in this direction on the morning of July 6, all their attacks were repulsed. Such a powerful resistance forced the Wehrmacht command to change the direction of attacks, having failed to break through the second line of Soviet defense in the area of the settlement. Olkhovatka. On July 7, about 200 German tanks attacked to the east, in the direction of the station Ponyri. Thus, the Germans tried to find vulnerabilities in the enemy's defenses. The Soviet command began to urgently deploy additional forces to this area, primarily artillery. However, it took time. Aviation could have reacted much more quickly to a change in the tactical situation. Illinois II attack aircraft, or, as they were also called, flying tanks, were raised towards the enemy. Soviet attack aircraft are designed to support ground troops on the front line. The enemy's front line is a zone up to 10 kilometers deep from the front line. There are concentrated infantry in the trenches, firing points, artillery positions, anti-aircraft artillery installations, tanks, gas stations, ammunition and fuel depots. It was against these targets that the stormtroopers struck, weakening the enemy's defenses and facilitating the advance of their troops. Designer Sergei Ilyushin provided his stormtrooper with good protection. The crew cabins, fuel tanks, engine and other important components were located inside the streamlined armored hull. The plane was very resilient. He returned from combat missions damaged more than once, sometimes there were more than 100 holes. By the beginning of the war, only 250 Il-2s had been built. At the same time, there were even fewer pilots who could fly and attack aircraft. And even those had minimal experience, which affected the effectiveness of the attack aircraft in the first month's wars. In addition, the Illinois II series was originally produced in a single-seat version. There was no shooter covering the plane from behind. In conditions where German aviation dominated the air, the aircraft often became easy prey for Luftwaffe fighters. The situation changed only by the autumn of the 42nd year. By that time, a two-seat version of the attack aircraft with a shooter had already been launched into production. Crew training has improved. A lot of attention was paid to tactics. Actions were practiced as part of a pair of aircraft, a squadron, and a regiment. Cooperation with the ground forces was established. The Illinois II aircraft needed an hour and a half to strike at the identified targets. At the beginning of the war, it took up to a day and a half. The Il-2's offensive armament included bombs of various calibers, machine guns, and cannons. It could carry up to 4 missiles under its wing. The order of use of a particular type of weapon depended on the task at hand. Bombs were usually dropped first to make the aircraft lighter and more maneuverable. Then it was the turn of the rockets, and only after that, the firing of cannons and machine guns. By the Battle of Kursk, a new weapon appeared in the stormtroopers' arsenal: anti-tank bombs. They had a cumulative warhead and were capable of piercing armor up to 60 mm thick. This was more than enough, as the bombs hit the most vulnerable upper part of the tank. For example, if the thickness of the Tiger's frontal armor plates was 100 to 110 mm, then the upper hull and turret plates were only 28 mm thick. The bomb was very small in size and weight. It could be loaded into the bomb bays of the Il-2 attack aircraft in the amount of 272 to 312 pieces. This ensured that at least one tank was guaranteed to be destroyed when dropped. If the distance between the tanks was about 75 meters, one tank was guaranteed to be hit, and this is a very good result. The armor effect of the cumulative jet consisted in hitting the crew with fragments of armor, which scattered from the rear. The fragments flew at a speed of 1,000–1,200 meters per second. Under the action of the cumulative jet, ammunition detonated, fuel and gasoline vapors in the fuel tank ignited. The use of these weapons under Kursk came as an unpleasant surprise to the Germans. On July 7, as a result of a massive Soviet airstrike, the enemy lost more than 30 tanks. According to the plan outlined by the German generals, their troops advancing from the south and north were to meet in Kursk on July 10. However, by the end of that day, the Germans were still very far from solving the task. Instead of the 150 kilometers that had to be covered on each side, they managed to wedge into the Soviet defenses only 10 kilometers from the north and 35 kilometers from the south. By that time, the situation in the air had also changed. The German fighters no longer had an overwhelming advantage. Moreover, the initiative gradually began to pass to the Soviet pilots. Therefore, the attack aircraft and bombers of the Red Army were becoming more active. Having failed to break through to Kursk by the shortest route, the Germans decided to strike a little to the east in the southern section of the Arc, with a general direction to the Prokhorovka railway station. It was here that the largest tank battle took place. In total, more than 1,200 tanks and self-propelled guns participated in it. By the end of July 11, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps had already managed to reach the nearest approaches to the Prokhorovka station. Units of the 3rd German Tank Corps also rushed here. The 69th Soviet Army was under threat of encirclement. The command decided to bring into battle the last remaining reserve, the 5th Guards Tank Army. It consisted of about 800 units of tracked vehicles. On July 13, a counter-tank battle unfolded near Prokhorovka. Protracted battles were fought with varying success. During the day, the multi-ton combat vehicles turned into piles of scrap metal. Turrets flew off tanks, hulls split, tracks burst. As a result of the battle, the Wehrmacht lost under Prokhorovka has up to 400 tanks. The army is almost twice as large. However, the Germans could not break through the Soviet defenses. It became clear to the German command, Operation Citadel failed completely. On the same day in the northern section Kursk Bulgaria the army launched a counteroffensive. The next day, the German defenses were breached, and by the end of July 13, Soviet troops had advanced 15 kilometers. By July 30, Soviet troops had already advanced 40 kilometers. On the morning of August 3, the offensive the Red Army began in the southern part as well Kursk Bulge. By the end of the summer, Soviet troops had fought 100 to 120 kilometers and leveled the front line. In the area Kursk was liberated Orel, Kharkiv and dozens of other settlements. After the defeat under at Kursk, the Wehrmacht no longer conducted major offensive operations on the Eastern Front. The strategic initiative has completely shifted to the Red Army. The war went back to where it came from, to Berlin.